Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be, and welcome to this virtual Charleston session entitled OA in Practice, Implementing a Successful Transitional Agreement. My name is David Fisher, and I'm the Group Vice President for Research Sales for Wiley, and I am very pleased to be joined today by two experts on the subject who are heavily involved in negotiating and implementing transformational agreements. For full disclosure, along with other publishers, they have transformational agreements with Wiley. First, I would like to introduce Terry Oakes Galloway, who is the Executive Director of the statewide California Electronic Library Consortium, or SCELC. Dr. Galloway serves over 100 member libraries by ensuring equitable access to resources, services, and technologies by maximizing purchasing power and sharing expertise. Her team was recently awarded a National Leadership Grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services for a program to enhance collection and participant diversity in shared print programs. She previously held the post of Executive Director and Associate Commissioner at Lewis, the Louisiana Library Network. Matthew Goddard is head of the Access and Acquisitions Department at the Iowa State University Library, which is responsible for the library's physical, electronic, and open acquisitions functions. Prior to arriving at Iowa State as the e-resources librarian in 2020, he was digital services librarian and assistant library director for resources at the California Baptist University in Riverside, California. The purpose of this session is to hear from Terry and Matthew about their experience managing and implementing transformational agreements, specifically around how it changes their roles, their interactions, and the library's relationships with faculty and researchers, and to hear what lessons they've learned, what pitfalls to avoid, and to find out what makes for them a successful agreement. By way of context, I thought a graph showing the exponential growth in open access articles, which have been driven by the implementation of transformative agreements around the world, would really demonstrate the relevance of today's topic and bring home that the impact of these agreements is tripling the number of articles published open every 3 years right now. This growth in reading and publishing agreements is only possible with collaboration and aligned goals. It needs both the institution or the consortia to be committed to supporting its authors to publish open, and the publisher to want to drive their portfolio open. This graph certainly suggests that this alignment is getting stronger and stronger. This information in the graph has come from the ESAC initiative and is referenced on the slide. I expect many of you watching today are looking to expand on your current agreements or are in negotiation to start agreements, or at the very least have publishers knocking on your door and to move into a transformational agreement. In today's session, both of our panelists will make their opening remarks, and we will then move into some discussion questions. And with that, I'd like to hand across first to Terry for her opening remarks, and then on to Matthew. Terry, over to you.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to give a little bit of context on SCELC very quickly. We are headquartered in Los Angeles, and our core business is licensing, and that includes centralized billing, ordering, and invoicing. We do have strong representation from California private academic institutions, though we work on behalf of academic research medical institutions across the US, over 300 institutions, in fact, that participate in our licensing programs, and we streamline their licensing while they benefit from our negotiated rates. So how do we work with that many institutions on prospective and actual transformational agreements? In the middle here, we have our licensing staff. On either side, we have subscribers and our SCALCOM communications representatives from our committees and special task force. As we look at agreements, we work to keep in mind the goals and objectives of both of those groups making sure that the agreement is appropriate to the subscriber's needs for cost containment, as well as the values of those involved in ScalComm. So what does that look like? Go to the next slide. With 3 agreements in place thus far and a few more in the queue, these are typical considerations that we bring to the publishers. We want a no cap feel. Regardless of whether there is a cap, we try to avoid the politics of allocating APC coverage. And we look to be within budget of the anticipated cost of the resource over time for a typical read agreement. From the administrative standpoint, we look to avoiding labor-intensive practices for both SCALC and the subscribing libraries. We centralize article approval or automate it, find ways to support and streamline when research funding is not in place or APC funds are not available, and look for publishers to have robust communication plans in place to support the needs of the consortium, the libraries, and the researchers or authors. As we become more experienced in these agreements, we look to monitor our success by evaluating each of these factors. What has been the experience of the stakeholder groups? If we used automated approval of articles, how did the filtering work? Did the right types of articles get approved? And finally, did we provide a healthy cost avoidance for institutions? Next. Another factor driving our selection and negotiation of agreements are the goals and values of our ScalComm community, as shown here. These are board-approved goals, and they are key considerations that others may wish to examine as they choose transitional or transformative agreement, and as their partners work to implement and assess those. Here, number 1, are we providing simple ways for authors to access these agreements, and are they easy for our libraries to administer, preferring strongly central administration, enabling retention of copyright, redistribution of costs, and fairly and sustainably. So I'll leave you with that. And I hope that these goals, which are helping us achieve our overall program values, also help you as you consider the same features within your own programs. With that, Matthew.
Great. Thank you, Terry. So what I'd like to start out with, and you can go ahead and move to the next slide, is just talk a little bit about the history of open access at Iowa State University Library. And so I think what we're doing is zooming in a little bit. So Terry was giving the consortial perspective, and now I'll give you the perspective of a particular library that is not working with a consortium on these agreements. So 3 years ago, 2019, the Iowa State Faculty Senate unanimously endorsed a document titled Principles for Advancing Openness Through Journal Negotiations. And there were 3 basic principles that document listed, and those were openness, transparency, and financial sustainability. And it was really that unanimous endorsement that gave us a really strong mandate for our full steam ahead approach that we've taken over the last 3 years. And so it's no coincidence that 2019 is also the year when we've signed our first read and publish or transformative agreements. And so fast forward 2022, we now have open access agreements with 19 different publishers. I hope that by the time you see this in November or later, that number is at least 20. We've got the 20th currently in the hopper. And you can see that there's quite a bit of variety across that portfolio of agreements. It includes both transformative or read and publish agreements, but also the pure open access agreements with publishers like PLOS and Frontiers. And under those agreements, we have opened or funded the open access publication of well over 800 articles. So next slide, please. So there's a lot going on this slide. And on the left, you have a table that lists some basic tasks or workflows or functions that we at Iowa State consider when we're implementing one of these agreements. And when I was initially thinking about this session, I imagined that I would discuss each of these, but that is a much longer and more detailed session. And so thankfully, we're going to be much briefer here today. And I'll just leave those up on the slide. And I do plan on being at the live Q&A. So if anybody has questions about any of these workflows or functions, I'd be happy to talk about those with you, or offline later. Of course, you can reach out. So I want to just show these and look at some different ways you can categorize these different functions. So we have both internal or back-end functions. So for example, funding approval for individual articles. But then there are also some things that we do that are specifically researcher facing, things that are communicating directly with our researchers. And here at Iowa State, we have, I think, a pretty nice division of labor where those researcher facing functions are handled by our really wonderful open access and scholarly communication librarian, Abby Elder. And so she's the the key point person for our researchers. And she has a very sort of public role. She's on more the public services side of the library. And so our researchers know that they can go to her with questions about these agreements. But on the back end, so my department is the Access and Acquisitions Department. We are a more back end sort of technical services department that's responsible for implementing the decisions that are being made about our collections by our Associate University Librarian, Curtis Brundy, and our Director of Collections and Open Strategies, Robin Sin. And that includes everything from buying a print book to licensing a database to signing one of these open access agreements. And so we're doing those back end workflows in my department. And I think that's been a good division of labor. We also have a division between functions that are done per agreement. So for example, negotiating, of course, the specifics of the contract language within those agreements, or overall for the entire initiative. So promoting open access on campus to our researchers, for example. But then there are also things that we do per submission. So one thing that we do is post-publication, we'll verify that the article is indeed actually open access in the way that we expect based on the reporting that we're getting from our publishers. So those are some just ways you can look at these different functions. I want to emphasize that most of these are not absolutely necessary. If you look at ESAC's recommendations for workflows, there is, I believe, one listed for libraries, and that is the funding approval. And even that is only strictly necessary for agreements that are capped or based on APCs in some way. So I don't want to scare anyone off who's looking at these agreements in this list on the left here. But at Iowa State, we are really looking to begin as we want to go on, to quote a Wiley marketing email I received this morning. And so we are really focused on doing this right from the outset. Now I'd like to just talk a little bit about some key decisions here on the right. These are decisions that we have made about these agreements that all of them have an impact on the different workflows there on the left. The first of those is that we really promote open access and not particular publishers. So sometimes there seems to be a sense from our publisher partners after we sign these agreements that we in the library are going to kind of be an arm of their marketing department and really promote this publisher to our researchers. But we really want to avoid that. And obviously we're interested in promoting open access publication in general to our researchers, but we don't want to be telling them where to publish. We want to leave that up to their discretion and their judgment. Our internal workflows, I've already mentioned this, are handled by the technical services unit. I think this is a big win for us. So e-resources staff, and that is the unit within my department that handles this specifically. E-resources librarians and e-resources staff are very much used to dealing with and managing information across a wide variety of platforms, which is what this work requires. It also breaks down divisions between different library units. I think a lot of times there may be, my sense is that this transition to open access is something that's happening in one area of the library, and that technical services staff, the folks who have done a lot of the sort of purchasing functions, are sort of being excluded from this future direction. And so we've I think given that staff a share in this future direction by putting it in this particular unit. And I think that's been a really great thing for us organizationally. Our strategy is based on publisher agreements like the ones we're talking about today, not on APC funds. I want to emphasize there that while the majority of our support is based on these agreements, we are big supporters also of Diamond initiatives, Subscribe to Open, the Knowledge Unlatched model, which I would really like to call Purchase to Open, but I don't know if that's trademarked. And these agreements, the reason why that is our focus is that these agreements are what is providing a mechanism for this transition. And it also gives us a voice as we're approaching the negotiating table, as we're beginning conversations with the publisher, helps us to shape that process and give us a chance to shape the future direction of all of this. We prefer uncapped agreements, so similar to what Terry indicated. If it's not uncapped, I like how she put that. We want it to have an uncapped, no cap feel. We want the costs to be predictable, of course, for budgetary reasons. We also want to be predictable for researchers. Last thing we want is to run out of funds or tokens 3/4 of the way through the year and say, sorry, you published in November, so you're out of luck. There are also less things to manage with these uncapped agreements because you typically will not need to do article level funding approvals for those. So finally, just to wrap up, simplicity for researchers, scalability for budget, equity for all. So simplicity for researchers, I really like, again, the phrase no-brainer value. I might steal that from you, Terry. We really want to be able to say to researchers, if you publish with publisher X, your article will be OA. And that statement, sort of obscures some necessary complexity with these agreements, because many of them, there are exclusions, there are carve-outs, there are journals that are not necessarily included. But we will go so far as to just simply pay the APC or the invoice of a researcher who approaches us and says, why was I sent this invoice? Rather than try to explain to him, well, him or her, this invoice is for a hybrid journal and we only cover gold or whatever, and see their eyes glaze over. We would like to just present a seamless view, even if on the back end the seams are showing. So simplicity, scalability. So obviously our budget here in the library is not going up, so we are looking for cost neutral agreements. And finally, equity. And this is a really important point and a good one for me to just wrap up on. As an unintended consequence of these agreements, the last thing we would want to do is to shift the inequities of access to inequities of publishing, and thereby lock out significant portions of the world and significant categories of researchers from all of this. So we as a library are really, really pressing all of the publishers that we're talking with about these agreements to really solidify some specific plans for equitable waiver programs that will help level the playing field and preserve and hopefully even enrich the diversity of scholarly communication. So that's what I wanted to talk about. So now I guess we'll go back to David for some questions.
You're handing back to me. Thank you so much, both of you. And I'd like to move us on to the panel part of today's show. And I'll kick things off with a fairly easy one. If you were giving advice to a librarian who's about to enter a transformative agreement with a publisher for the first time, what advice would you give them? And what are some of the potential pitfalls for them to watch out for? Terry, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, speaking from a consortial perspective, we are at quite a distance from the authors. And so I think author workflow is something that is really important to understand and take a look at. Your office, whoever is managing this, could potentially create a lot of support requests and administrative kind of time sucks if you don't clearly understand the author workflow that the publisher has in place. It is one thing to enter into an agreement and offer that benefit. It's another to actually make good on it so that people can and will choose publishing. The last thing you want to do is tank your OA publishing rate by putting into place a bad workflow or a challenging workflow, and potentially go from, a 60% OA publication rate down to a 10-15% rate because people could not understand from an author perspective or even from a librarian perspective, what do I need to do to get this over the last hurdle for OA publication.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Matthew.
Yeah, so, and just to emphasize one of Terry's points, I do think that author submission process is a really key to the success of these agreements, and very subtle changes can have a significant impact because, I think there's a subset of our researchers who are really fully committed to publishing open access, regardless of, the obstacles that they may face. But I think there's a very significant chunk of our researchers who have a very, they support it, but they have a very low threshold for any sort of like obstacles or confusion, and they'll sort of revert to the safe option at the least sign of any sort of, I sense that like whether they're going to get an invoice, or they might not even want the library to get an invoice. Well, I like go away, but I don't want the library to have to pay an invoice. So what we've seen is that author journey during the submission process, when it comes to how opt-outs happen, whether it's opt-out or opt-in, choosing a license for their publication is a key step. And so we really try to get a view in that process, especially when we're signing a new agreement. And I would really recommend that libraries do take the time to at least be walked through that process so that they have a sense of what it looks like. And if possible, if you can even get screenshots of that and be able to refer back to those, especially when you get questions from researchers about the process. So that's one like very specific thing. More broadly though, about just giving advice, I think these are, to an extent, like they're what you make it. Depending on your staffing resources, you can certainly sign one of these agreements and for the most part, just let it run. That's one thing that I wanted to emphasize with, Iowa State, I think is at one extreme in terms of just how involved we are with these agreements, but it is not strictly necessary to be that hands-on. At the same time, I would say that you want to consider what this looks like 5-10 years down the road. We have this really intentional strategy of growing the pie, of our institutional research, and so we're being really intentional about setting the groundwork for a much broader transition. So this isn't just about signing a handful of agreements. This is about moving our collections budget from subscriptions to open access publishing. And so we're really trying to be thoughtful about that. And that's one thing I think that it would be good for all libraries at this point to think about what you want that to look like, and be able to shape that process.
Thank you. Well, Matthew, you brought up the success word, and well, I'll switch into a what does success look like question. How do you evaluate the success of individual transformational agreements in your institution or in your consortium? As Matthew, as you brought it up, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So this is very much a work in progress. I don't think we have really hit upon the magic formula that's really telling us how we're doing with these agreements. At that specific agreement level, cost per article is a sort of the basic unit of analysis. Of course, there are significant issues with that, especially with read and publish agreements, because you have both your read costs and your publish costs, and those may not even be broken down within the agreement. You may not even really know, how much are you paying for read, how much are you paying for publishing, and even if you do know, and even if those are broken down, there's a little bit of a sense that they're somewhat arbitrary and fuzzy categories. So putting but we do try to look at, just like you have cost per use, you have cost per article, and look at those side by side and to get a sense. But even aside from those issues, you still have, there's still only sort of really brute metrics. And so we do try to look at other factors as well. And at a broader sort of program level, we're really, like I said, focused on growing the portion of our institutional research pie that's open access. And so at that level, success really means just growing that portion while at the same time containing our costs.
And Terry, is it any different for you with 100 institutions in Scalc? How do you evaluate the success of the agreements you've negotiated?
Sure, and going back to my opening remarks, I think a successful experience is an important thing that we need to be building. Assessment measures the author experience, the consortial time on task. So one thing we've talked a lot about is, okay, if we have 600 APCs covered in this agreement, in this one agreement, and it takes us even 30 minutes of one person's time to deal with each of these. And as Matthew is multiplying this times 20, is this a good use of institutional or organizational time? How can we improve our time on task relative to supporting these agreements? I think the cost per article, the cost avoidance type things are important, but at the end of the day, increasing readership is a very important aspect of why we all came to this OA conversation. And so finding ways to look at how we're impacting access to the scholarship and reusage of it is really important for evaluation.
Thank you. And you've opened up very nicely for my next question is what has changed for you? What has changed in roles in the library from 3 years ago? I think you were saying, Matthew, your first TA was 3 years ago. Are these new roles you've had to bring in? Have you changed people's roles?
Yeah, so I certainly, things have changed even since I started here 2 years ago. And I kind of alluded to that. So I came in sort of midstream in 2020, and up until that point, our implementation of all these agreements and really the management of them was handled by our scholarly communication and open access librarian that I mentioned. And it was soon after I started that I took it over and moved those functions into the access and acquisitions department. And then prior to that, into the e-resources unit. We've had some organizational changes, but that has been, I think, a significant change in just our overall approach that, like I said, has really, I think, paid dividends in a number of ways. It's had a broader, that's within the library, but looking at across campus, it's had a significant impact on our I think our relationship with our researchers and our faculty, and it's in that sense, I think it's part of continues a trend that's been in place for a number of years. So we have had a really, really rich digital repository, institutional repository program, as well as a digital press that publishes open access. And this is sort of just continuing that and really starting to hopefully continuing this shift from, obviously a building with a lot of books in it. Well, we're not that anymore. Well, you're the place that, provides me the access to this paywalled stuff. Well, we are that, but that's not all we are now. And now it's really a lot more of partners in scholarly communication and helping make all of this more equitable and accessible.
Thank you. And Terry, what roles for, I know you're centrally managing there, what's changed?
I would say the involvement of the whole team in some of these agreements has now become critical, where we may have approached a multi-year renewal with really a focus on cost containment. These multi-year renewals now, we're always looking for that transformative element.
Yeah, like I said, I don't think it's necessarily a change, but certainly a continuation of a development that's been in process for some time. As the library has signed more of these agreements, I think one thing that we are noticing, I guess I should just speak for myself and say that I have noticed in conversations with our researchers, you sometimes get the sense that they really appreciate these agreements, but they see them kind of as like this sort of additional perk that like, oh, it's nice that the library is providing these. Isn't that sweet of them? And we really try to emphasize that like this isn't just sort of like an additional like add-on to our main services. Like this is a fundamental shift of what we're doing. Like we're moving, this is where we're moving. And I think that is a change that is still in process.
Right. And Terry, for you, what about your members? Has their perception of the consortium changed?
I think we are now approaching an area where our negotiations and our process expand beyond even just our current members and affiliates in our consortia, recognizing the collective power for organizations, specifically in California, in our case, to act together to influence change, and how something that we might sign is going to impact the priorities and goals of other organizations. So we have begun to have conversations cross-consortially about our strategies and how we can support one another to, enact change with publishers.
Exciting times. Thank you. I know we're at time, and once again, I'd like to thank both Terry and Matthew for taking the time to join us today, and thank you all for tuning into our session. We hope you found it informative and valuable. This session is recorded and can be referred to over the next year. You can also find our contact details here on the slide. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at any time. And I will say Matthew is going to be available live when this is shown. And if there is some Q&A there, please give him some questions to answer live. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and look forward to next time.